I assumed my dad wanted to chat when he invited me into his room that evening, but I had no idea it would become my dad touching me on the most perplexing yet memorable night of my life, like as it began the first night I arrived. And even though I froze, I didn't draw away when I pulled into the driveway of my summer vacation home. It appeared smaller than I had remembered, and the paint had already begun. The grass was uneven, dry, and peeling, close to the gutters as if no one had. It was strange to watch it diminish in this manner after spending some time caring for it. Exhausted, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation of something that wasn't returning, I sat there for a minute, holding on to the idling engine, steering wheel more forcefully than necessary because I hadn't been home for months. Now that Mom was gone, nobody actually used the word divorced, only the void she left behind. I hadn't spoken to Dad much, and the noise behind me was louder than any explanation. Following it, there were a few brief texts sent here and there, and one phone call that concluded with we were both acting as though nothing was wrong, and I wasn't sure what to anticipate. I silenced the engine and took my duffel bag from the passenger as I walked back into his world after all this time. As I walked, the late afternoon sun scorched the driveway beneath my trainers. I approached the door, which was unlocked, pushed it open, and entered the house. It didn't smell stale like dust, coffee, or old air freshener. Terrible, just empty, the kind of emptiness that seeps into the furnishings and walls. Dad was in the living room when I entered, and even the light feels dimmer. He looked up from his old recliner, and neither of us spoke for a moment. He had grayer hair, but it wasn't the only change I noticed. His face appeared slightly slimmer in the temples, as if he had shed some unnecessary weight. His eyes had a hollowness in them that hadn't existed before, and he said, "Hey, kid!" with more force than I had anticipated. Said, clearing his throat at last as if the words had been stuck, "You made it." "Yeah," I said, placing my traffic wasn't too bad, so he nodded as he put his luggage down awkwardly at the door. All I could say was that I lingered there for a while, unsure of whether I should take A. Instead of hugging or simply waving like a fool, he got up and clapped his hand on a heavy, lingering touch that grasped my shoulder a bit too tightly. I attempted to act like it felt normal before letting go, saying things like, "You want something to eat? I could toss something together," he said, already in motion. Despite having a knotted tummy, I responded, "Yes," heading towards the kitchen. Over sandwiches and chips, we struck up a conversation. Dad inquired about classes, my flat, and whether my car was still misbehaving. I inquired about the house, the neighbors, and the overall climate. After dinner, we ended up rehearsing like two performers, fumbling through a script they hadn't used in a long time. Once more, a baseball game is playing quietly on the TV in the living room. I sat on the other end of the couch listening to background sounds more than anything else. I pretended not to notice how frequently my dad looked over while browsing through my phone. His eyes were probing at me rather than angry or disapproving. I convinced myself that I was attempting to commit to memory, something that was fading away, even though I was exhausted after the travel. There was a part of me that constantly picked up on the things I didn't want to confess, and I felt his eyes weigh down on me when the sun. "Dad got up and stretched, getting to turn in," he stated, as the house began to darker, as the sun began to set. "You remember where everything is?" he asked in a rough-edged voice. Uh, yeah, I, he chuckled gently and forced a smile, saying, "Not like you changed the layout." He stopped in the hallway, staring back at me as though he wanted to add something else, but there was no genuine humor in it. Ultimately, he simply nodded and vanished into his room where I sat. After he departed, He stared at the TV for a long, without really seeing it. I finally forced myself to go upstairs to the guest room, which was still officially mine and had the same appearance as a museum display of the old posters, dusty books, and a few lost items from my adolescence. Everything was stuck in time when I unpacked, with trophies lining the shelf. Putting my laptop on the desk and haphazardly putting clothing in drawers, I just flopped into the bed completely clothed and stared at it without bothering to take a shower. The house creaked and nestled around me with familiar sounds coming from the damaged ceiling. That seemed strange in some way, so I browsed through my phone without actually reading. Anything to divert my attention from the nagging sensation in my stomach. Must have fallen asleep at some time, since my phone was buzzing frantically against the nightstand the next moment. The room was completely dark, save for the gentle pounding of my heart. When I sprang upright, I looked at the screen's illumination and saw a new message from Dad, but I was still asleep. Bringing my thoughts to my room, and I just stared at my brain for a moment. Dad wasn't the type of person who texted, and I was refusing to accept what I was witnessing, particularly not in the same home. If he wanted something, he typically simply yelled or knocked from the hallway, releasing the tension that had been building all. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the evening as it boiled up and pricked my flesh. Screen, perhaps he was ill or needed assistance with something, but I never imagined. I slipped out of bed and moved silently, knowing that this was the start of something even more bizarre. The house across the room was excessively quiet, with each floorboard creaking more loudly than it should have, felt thicker beneath my feet. Like if the entire house was holding its breath. The light from beneath Dad's door spilt onto the hallway. I could get to his room in 3 minutes, since the carpet had a narrow, faint gold line. Steps, if I so desired. I stood there for a while, feeling the weight and my heart racing. A foolish, childish voice in my thoughts, as the quiet pressed down on me, whispered that everything would change the moment I stepped inside that door once more, but I still moved, my fingers quivering a little as I grabbed for the door and pushed it open, revealing a heavier object underneath and the scent of whiskey. Dad was perched on the edge of something warmer, more perilous, and more human. The bed, with his head bent, as if he had been thinking, and his elbows resting on his knees. When he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, it was too hard for too long. "Hey," he said. There was something raw in his eyes that tugged at a part of me I didn't want to recognize. I lingered there awkwardly while he remarked, "You're still up?" His voice was low and scratchy, like if he hadn't spoken in hours. Even though I was unsure, my voice told me to text you to go. He nodded and carefully dragged a hand through the thick air, feeling too small and thin. His hair, I simply couldn't sleep, and I reasoned that perhaps you couldn't either. The soft, almost enticing remarks made me realize that I should have turned around, muttered an explanation about needing to go back to bed since they were weary, but I was stuck where he patted the chair because of the way he sat and the way his shoulders slumped. A gentle invitation to sit with me for a while on the mattress next to him. Before my thoughts could catch up, I crossed the room and sat rigidly on the edge of the mattress, sliding slightly beneath my body, the bed with a cautious distance between us weight. Something I couldn't identify caused the air between us to crackle. He said, "You've grown up so much," after a lengthy load that was too heavy to breathe. "You're not that little boy," he said quietly, his tone bordering on admiration and melancholy. No longer difficult to believe. Occasionally, I made a brief, uncomfortable laugh in an attempt to suppress the getting a shiver down my back. I suppose that's what college is like. A slight smile flickered across his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes or his hand, raised nearly mindlessly and gently landed between my shoulder blades at first, it was just a gentle, constant pressure, similar to how a father might soothe a son, but then his hands began to trace slow, purposeful circles over the thin. My t-shirt's fabric was hanging around a little longer than it should have, so I moved it a little, pretended to move me, but his touch simply caused me to slide down and lower himself. My back curved towards my waist, and the contact caused my skin to prickle. "You used to sleep against me like this when your muscles were locked up," he added. With a softer tone now, he said, "You'd crawl into a kind of aching nostalgia after having a nightmare, snuggle up against my side." I nodded silently while gazing at the distant wall, unsure of how to react. His hand slid lower while I pretended that I could prevent the situation from getting worse if I didn't look at him. Dangling perilously on the brink of what was then still deemed innocent, he pushed it to my thigh in a deliberate, slow manner, pressing it firmly on. Every muscle in my body strained as the weight of his hand was placed on the denim of my jeans. He didn't move it at first, but it was an intolerable, silent acknowledgement of all we weren't supposed to admit, simply left it there, warm, substantial, and incorrect. "You're so tense," he said. My thumb started making languid, feather-like circles on my leg, saying, "It's just me, it's just Dad." Felt too hot and too small, so I forced myself to look at the wall more intently, without reacting, willing my body to keep the terrible glimmer of something else growing inside of me that you don't have, and the terror from betraying. "To be terrified," he said in a low, hushed voice. "You're safe here." But I wasn't. I was no longer able to sense the change in the way the air vibrated. His hand moved a tiny bit at a time, inching upward, carving he drew a clearer distinction between what was and wasn't fatherly with his. The other hand, which should have been defensive but felt almost reverent, brushed my hair away from my forehead. His fingers continued to trace my hairline, my ear's curvature, and the eye flinched instinctively on the side of my jaw, but he only grinned pitifully as if he realized something I didn't. "But you're still my boy." He looked up as he said the words, sliding as if nothing had happened. My heart ached when he heard me say, "Morning," his countenance brightening. "Casual, easy," he said. "Morning, He placed a stack of pancakes in front of me and muttered as he sank into a chair at the kitchen table. "In addition to a glass of orange juice and a bottle of syrup, the scent should contain been reassuring, wasn't it? It simply made the space between us seem thicker and heavier. Every clink of my fork against the dish felt louder than it was during our silent meal. The house itself should have leaned in to listen, but Dad didn't say. He simply ate his meal and didn't act as though anything else was amiss. Sipped his coffee and looked up at me every now and then, but his expression was too gentle and full of something I couldn't afford, a careful inspection, so he cleared the plates and, leaning nonchalantly against the sink, he washed off the counters as if it were any other July morning before turning to face me, stated, "The shed is a mess after the event, so perhaps we could work on it later." Cold. I glanced at him, the suggestion striking more forcefully than usual. I was unsure of how to say no, as he grabbed me again. We spent the most of the afternoon outside, going through old, dusty tools without breaking anything. Crates of rubbish. The labor was dull and foolish, just the kind of stuff I would. Although I rolled my eyes a year ago, I'm now thankful for it. Provided me with something to concentrate on, something to occupy my hands and my mind. My quieter father kept the conversation light by inquiring about my academics and making fun of me, for I smiled at my muscles' pitiful condition as I labored to raise a large box. He seemed unaware of the brittle sound as he stumbled along, or perhaps he just, for a little moment, I pretended not to. It felt nearly normal, like maybe last night had only been a nightmare, a strange, intoxicated error that we could both agree upon in silence. I forgot that I allowed myself to accept it because it was more convenient than confronting the reality, yet later that night after dinner and a peaceful TV session that neither of us really watched, normal couldn't go forever. The screen, I fled upstairs to my room's safety, closed the door, and leaned against it and let out a slow breath. I considered locking it, but I decided against it. Didn't want to acknowledge that I was still not comfortable sitting on the eye. I was aimlessly browsing through my phone on the side of my bed when I heard a gentle. I scowled as I walked across the room to retrieve the tiny folded. When I unfolded the message that had gotten through the crack, my palms trembled a little. The handwriting seemed familiar, but it was hurried. I miss the days when you trusted me. I felt something split open as I stared at the words for a while, still needing you. It felt depressing and lonely inside of me, but it wasn't a threat or even a demand. I sat down heavily on the couch because my chest hurt from a grief I didn't know how to handle. Bed, with the note crumpling a little in my palm, I felt like tearing it up too. A larger part of me wanted to curl up with the blankets, but I wanted to toss it across the room and act like I hadn't seen it. He needed me, I thought, trying to conceal from the perplexing pull inside my chest. Louder than the protestations of everyone who understood how terrible this was, in my opinion, he needed me. And I secretly realized that I also needed him, just not as much as a son would. Ought to be dependent on his father, but in a manner that frightened me even more. I reclined on I felt the burden of the day pressing down on me as I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling once more. I had a type of tightness in my body that was unrelated to box sorting or bringing tools downstairs while the TV hummed softly. My skin pricked when the sounds of the refrigerator filled the kitchen and the home settled into the night. Something hotter and more deadly was twisting low in my stomach as I waited with dread. I pondered if I would allow him to knock on my door again tonight. I tried to calm him at this time by pressing the heel of my hand on my chest. Perhaps if I remained motionless and silent throughout the night, my heart's frenzy pulse would stop, would go by like any other, and perhaps I could pretend last if I closed my eyes. Maybe I wouldn't answer the door if he knocked, but in my heart I already knew the truth, and I'm not sure how I could stop him if he came for me. I lay there for a long time, my chest clenched with something I couldn't, staring at the ceiling. Suddenly, every noise in the home seemed to be amplified, including the stairwell's creak, the refrigerator's hum, and the TV's soft flickering below. The words of the note he had slipped beneath my door were still burning on the nightstand. I still need your part, and I miss the way you used to trust me. I detested how painful it was to read it, but I also detested how much I wanted to respond to that need. The knock was so gentle that I almost thought I had dreamed it. I was apprehensive and just heard 3 soft taps. At first, I just lay there. I was holding my breath when I heard a somewhat louder knock. Henry, I just want to talk. Then there's a low, broken voice. The words were desperate, yet they weren't demanding or frightening. I knew I should remain still, so I closed my eyes and pretended to be I was sleepy, but my body cheated on me by moving my legs before my head could catch up. For a long moment, my fingers lingered over the doorknob as I crossed the room to it. Dad was standing barefoot in the hallway when I twisted it open, wearing an old sweatpants and t-shirt, and his hair was disheveled as if he had been dragging his hands. Through it, his red-rimmed, watery eyes begged, before breaking off. I just can't do this alone anymore. I swallowed hard. The dam inside me. Without thinking, I took a step back, widened the door, and invitation, he entered carefully, as if he was worried that I would alter if he proceeded too quickly. For a few period, we simply stood there in the faint hallway light, my mind. With a trembling breath, he continued, the space between us is heavy with everything unsaid. Reached out and placed his warm, shaking hands on my shoulders. My stiff instinct told me to get away, but I let him to touch me instead, let him to lead me in till our bodies touched, and I could sense the warmth of, you don't have to say anything, he said as he sank into my skin. Filled with more than just sadness, I said, just let me hold you. I didn't. In response, I simply remained there, while his arms wrapped around me and drew me into his chest. When I didn't pull away, I could feel his breath catch, and his fingers digging into my back as if he were worried that if he didn't hold on tight enough, I would disappear because his body was sturdy, and I pressed my forehead against his shoulder, shaking against mine, and closed my firmly, trying to ignore how awful it was, but all I could sense was how cozy he felt against my hands, how secure and perilous he felt, carefully traced my spine's contours through my shirt, learning the one hand slid up and threaded into my body as if he hadn't been let to for years, one strayed lower, slipping under, while the other cradled the back of my head. I cringed when the hem of my shirt touched my exposed skin because it touched every nerve. Awakened, bewildered, and ravenous, you remain my kid, he said, his voice trembling against my hair. He said, you'll always be my boy. I clenched my hold on him and let out a breath that was something between a sigh and a sob. I gripped the thin material of his t-shirt with my hands as they slid up his back. He drew back, giving me something to grasp onto as the ground moved beneath me, his thumbs caressing my jaw, his hand cradling it, and his gaze guiding. His dark, heavy eyes were filled with things we couldn't discuss. Instead of pushing him away and running, I leaned into his touch. His thumb slowly and respectfully touched my bottom lip, while my heart pounded so fiercely that I felt it could burst open. His eyes briefly shifted to my mouth before returning to my eyes, quietly requesting, we both knew the answer to the question, so I just nodded slightly. At early light, he leaned down and pressed his lips to my forehead. He pushed a second kiss across my temple while I was trembling and nearly chaste. His hands were all over the place this time, slipping up beneath my shirt that follows the lines of my ribs, the dip of my waist, and the exposed skin of my sides. His pulling me closer caused my entire body to tremble, and I let out a quivering breath. His fingers slipped lower, splaying across the floor, leaving no room between us. It was horrifying how the small of my back guided me to flush against him. My body reacted so naturally that I tilted towards him in search of. He breathed me in as he pressed his lips against the crook of my neck. Every gentle, forbidden touch made my knees go down on the delicate skin there. Weaker caused my internal knot of need and shame to tighten, saying, "You are," he muttered, his voice harsh, on my throat. "Beautiful. You're everything." I choked back a sound that might have been made as I pressed my eyes shut. My hands gripped his shirt in a quiver, needing something to steady me. Before I overwhelmed by the intensity of everything, he gently raised me and led me back till my. Without thinking, I sat down as his legs struck the side of the bed, and he crouched in front of me. I looked down at him as his soft yet powerful hands framed my thighs. Breathless, he slowly and respectfully kissed the inside of my knee. As if it was sacred, I felt his hands slide up over my legs and squeeze them tenderly, tilting forward, fingers digging into his hair and drawing him in. We were crossing a boundary that would never be uncrossed, so I knew I should stop. But when he leaned up and didn't move and pressed his forehead against mine, breathing me in as if I were the only thing keeping him together, I pushed closer for a while, but neither of us moved. The heavy, dense air between us vibrated with something too large for Dad's hands rested softly on my thighs and his forehead, and one of us could name him. Smashed into mine, both of us inhaling as if we were drowning. I closed my eyes, feeling the shaky rise and fall of what had just surfaced. His fingers slightly tightened against my chest, grounding me. He was simply waiting there without pulling or forcing anything, waited for me to make a decision, and when I did, I leaned forward and brushed my nose against. I heard the deep, low, broken sound he made, even though it was the smallest action. His entire body stiffened under my touch, holding back in his throat. Fearful of making a mistake, his lips touched mine without being harsh, demanding, but a gentle, timid kiss that seemed like a prayer because he was incredulous. Sincerely, I shuddered as the heat of it tore through me, destroying everything. Wall I had attempted to construct, the kiss deepened, and the lips moved slowly and carefully. His hands rubbed my skin against theirs with a desperate affection. Sides pulling my shirt up till his hands touched my exposed skin, feeling his warmth my breath caught when he pressed against me and my fingers curled more tightly in his hair. With his thumb caressing the corner of my jaw, he drew back just enough to gaze at me. You sure? I acknowledged that it was unsafe and incorrect, yet nothing had ever felt more. Unavoidably, he gave me another deeper kiss, this time feeling my lines with his hands as they skimmed higher beneath my shirt. Body, as if he had to commit to memory every inch I allowed him to, because I craved it, his intimacy, warmth, and ability to make me feel loved and seen in a way that no one else can. I've never had my father shift and gently push me back into the bed or mattress, sank below us while he hovered over me, supporting himself with his arms to prevent crush me, his forehead lying against my cheek and his breath ragged against. His voice was full with emotion as he spoke. You're everything I ever needed. I gulped and looked up at him, sliding my hands down his sides and felt I pulled his shirt up, revealing muscle beneath the softness, and he paused only a moment before throwing it aside and raising it over his head. Had never witnessed him so exposed and vulnerable. His chest rose, and I reached up and delicately brushed my fingers as I dropped in weak, anxious breaths across the muscles and scars, sensing how he shuddered as I touched him slowly. Undressed myself as well, slowly and respectfully lifting my shirt as if it were his. Hands were rough and calloused, but his touch was a sacred thing, so soft as though he feared that if he moved too quickly I could shatter. At last it was completely against my skin, and I gasped as I felt it. Everywhere we touched, the heat became deeper and sank into my bones, kissed me across my collarbone and down my neck, each kiss a gentle, heartfelt apology for his shaking hands moved over me, confirming everything we both knew we couldn't reverse. Patience, learning every bend, breath, every sound I made, arching into. We moved him without intending to do so because he was more desperate than ever for something to keep me anchored in the storm, initially, awkwardly and slowly settling into a rhythm that was more about more intimacy than anything else. It was gradual and neither hurried nor forceful, incredibly sensitive to every skin-to-skin contact. He made a silent confession, repeatedly breathed my name into my mouth, hair and neck, like a prayer. Henry, every word. Henry, my boy, etched itself more deeply into me till I wasn't sure. Where I started and he finished, I gripped him tightly, pressing my nails into his back and gasping against his lips, sensing my guilt evaporating beneath him, was still vibrating beneath my skin, but the tidal wave drowned it away. The need of submission, and once it was ended, we remained entangled, sweating, and Dad moved, bringing me closer and pressing my head against his as he shook and remained mute. His heartbeat thundered beneath my ear like it had when I was a child. Despite his panic and fear, his firm fingers slowly went through my hair, anchoring me with gentle strokes whilst everything inside me cried out that nothing would ever be the same again, and I should have retreated. I pressed closer instead of saying anything to break the spell, breathing him in while pressing my face against his skin, as if it were the only thing holding me to the ground. He hugged me tightly and said, "I'm sorry," in a weak voice that he muttered into my hair. Henry's tears burned my burning, angry eyes as he said, "I'm so sorry," but I blinked. I wasn't ready for words back then, and I wasn't sure if I would ever be everything I knew. Was that I lingered until the room was painted a delicate gold. When the first rays of dawn appeared through the window, perhaps it's still there, wrapped up in him like a secret scar. Or surrender wasn't safe, wasn't proper, or wasn't love in the world's sense, would acknowledge it, but it belonged to us, and I didn't refuse it after that night. A single error, it occurred often that morning, and we hardly spoke to each other. There was a new type of us avoiding one another, as if the flooring would fall if we moved too quickly. Of friction between us, something raw and electric that neither of us could act as though he wasn't there when I glanced across the kitchen at his. When his voice fell to a low tone, his palm touched my back too lightly to be an accident. For me, it was all there, vibrating beneath the surface, waiting later in a faint murmur. That day, it occurred once more, an additional touch that lasted too long, another kiss that I convinced myself it was a fluke, and it began with an apology and ended with desperation, saying it didn't matter and that we were lonely, but it was a lie I couldn't keep on for a long time. When I eventually departed that summer, I packed my duffel bag and I believed I would be able to depart as I drove back towards the life I was meant to be creating it behind as well, but perhaps the separation would cause it to dissolve into something I could put it out of my mind, but I couldn't quit thinking about him and how it felt to be sorely needed and wanted every time he texted, every time I returned home, and every late-night call that went on longer than necessary. I was sucked back under. Following those extended weekends, holiday getaways, and brief trips, it never happened again. Speaking out loud, a handshake is always unavoidable but never intended. Glancing too long over the dinner table in the hallway, after a late-night meal, catching up that concluded with the same hushed apologies as usual. Desperate touches the complex web of loneliness, remorse, and love that we never daring to say that June evening we crossed a line, and once it was crossed there, no matter how much I told myself it was wrong, there was no turning back. No matter how firmly I closed my eyes and attempted to forget some of it, he muttered that he was sorry on my skin. Things you don't return from, and perhaps I never wanted to. However, some stories don't end at this point. Therefore, this wasn't the end for him or me. Every time you get home, they merely entice you further to find out what transpired next. Remember to subscribe. The narrative is only getting started.